They found him in silence. Not his bones, not his name, only walls like sun-bleached ribs rising from the desert and a seal pressed into clay by a vanished hand. There was no body, no words, no songs, just the ruins of a dream drowned in sand. Long before empires etched their names into stone, before kings claimed descent from gods, before iron clawed its way into the flesh of the world, there was a land that flourished like an impossible garden between the desert and the mountains. It was called the Oxus by later tongues, but its people had no single name for it. They called it only the oasis, the green between, the place of life. It stretched from the southern edge of what would one day be Turkmenistan, across the river plains of northern Afghanistan, to the ancient bones of the Hindu Kush. Here the sun burned merciless, but underground rivers ran cold and sweet. If you could tame the water, you could make the desert bloom. It was into this world that the boy was born, the boy who would one day be known to us only as the Lord of Dashley. He was not born in Dashley itself. That fortress had not yet risen from the sand. He came from a cluster of reed-roofed houses on the fringe of a canal, where the mud was soft and black beneath his feet and the air smelled of wet earth. His people were farmers and herders, bending the river's gift into furrows of barley and fields of flax. Yet even as a child, he watched the horizon more than the furrows. He watched the caravans pass like wandering bones across the steppe, their donkeys laden with lapis from the mountains, gold from the far west, carnelian from the Indus. The air trembled with their bells. The boy's eyes trembled too. His mother told him the old stories by firelight, of how the earth was once covered in water, and the gods drained it with their breath to make space for people, of how the dead rose as stars. She pressed tokens of fired clay into his small palms, amulets of bulls and snakes and crescent moons. Power is a thing you cannot see, she told him, but you can hold it if your hands are steady. He believed her. He always would. The world around him was stirring. Across the oasis belt, people were building like never before. Mudbrick walls rose thick and straight, latticed with timber, their shadows stretching over fields of green. Canals forked like the veins of a giant leaf. Markets blossomed where caravans converged, filled with obsidian blades, turquoise beads, spindles of fine wool. From the west came merchants with beards braided in copper wire. From the east came men with dark hair and sharp eyes, speaking words as quick as birdsong. The oasis was no longer a quiet cradle of barley and sheep. It was becoming something larger, something that could challenge time. The boy saw this. More importantly, he felt it. He felt the pulse of a new kind of world, one built not just on survival but on ambition. He began to dream of walls taller than the date palms, of towers that would not crumble even when the rivers changed their course, of storerooms so vast they could feed the people for 100 winters. He did not have a word for empire, but that is what he dreamed of, even as a child running barefoot along the canal banks. He was clever, and the elders noticed. They sent him to serve at a nearby temple, where he learned to count grain tallies on clay tablets, to read the patterns of stars, to memorize the rites that opened and closed the seasons. He learned how power flowed, not like the river, but like water in hidden channels, quietly unseen until it broke the surface in fountains of glory or death. He learned the language of seals, the tiny carved stones pressed into wet clay to mark ownership, to bind a promise, to enforce obedience. He learned that the world was held together by symbols as much as by walls. It changed him. When he was still young, the old governor of the Dashley Oasis died. Dashley was not yet a city, just a cluster of granaries and guard posts strung along a river branch. But it was a key node on the caravan routes. Whoever controlled it controlled the flow of wealth between the mountains and the sea. The elders of his clan saw an opening. They sent him, barely grown, as their envoy to the council of merchants and priests who would choose the new governor. He wore a robe of undyed wool and a necklace of river shells polished to bone white. He spoke with measured words, never looking down. And somehow, impossibly, they chose him. Perhaps they saw his hunger. Perhaps they saw the shape of destiny coiling behind his eyes. Or perhaps they were simply tired, and he was the only one young enough to believe in the future. He rode to Dashley at dawn on a white donkey. The air was sharp with the scent of wet clay from the riverbanks. The fortress that would one day dominate the oasis did not yet exist. There were only low warehouses of mudbrick, their walls blistered by the sun, and a single wooden watchtower leaning like an old man. The people watched him ride in, silent, their faces narrow and windburned. They did not cheer, they did not bow, they only watched. He dismounted in the courtyard, placed his hand on the cracked bricks, and whispered a vow only the earth could hear, that he would build something that would never die. That night he walked the perimeter of the outpost under the cold blaze of the stars. He traced lines in the dust with his finger. Walls, gates, granaries, canals, houses, temples, all fitting together like the bones of a giant. In his mind he saw the fortress rising, a perfect square, each side guarded by a gate flanked with towers, its center filled with storerooms and halls, its heart a sanctum of fire and silence. Around it he saw fields spreading like green cloth, caravans queuing at the gates, guards pacing the walls with copper-tipped spears flashing in the sun. But more than this, he saw something deeper. He saw a name that would outlast death. His name. The desert wind hissed across the plain like a warning. He ignored it. He began the next morning. He summoned every able-bodied man from the oasis and beyond, offering grain and cattle for their labor. He drew plans on clay boards, scraping lines with a reed stylus, calculating angles of shadow and weight. He ordered the first bricks fired in great kilns fueled by tamarisk wood. He conscripted artisans to carve seals and mark each consignment, to bind the work under his authority. The ground shook with the pounding of hammers and the cries of oxen dragging stone. Dust rose in curtains, glowing red in the dawn. It was not just construction, it was transformation. As the walls climbed, so did he. His name spread downriver with the caravans. Traders began to stop at Dashley, bringing lapis from Badakhshan, tin from the Iranian plateau, turquoise from the far deserts. They found order here. Guards at the gates measured rations, fair tolls. They found safety, and they paid for it gladly. The boy who had walked barefoot on canal mud was becoming a lord. Yet he felt no triumph, only the tightening of a knot inside him, a tension he could not name. At night when the workers slept and the stars hung like cold nails in the sky, he stood alone on the half-finished walls and stared into the blackness. Beyond the oasis lay nothing, endless silence, endless night. He imagined it creeping toward him like a tide, swallowing his walls, erasing his name. He clenched his fists until his nails drew blood, as if pain could anchor him to the earth. He told no one. Outwardly he was serene, inexorable, a figure of order, but inside he feared the truth, that nothing lasted. Not walls, not names, not even memory. Still, he built. By the time the sun wheeled full circle, the skeleton of the great fortress stood against the sky. Its double walls rose like twin jaws of stone. Its T-shaped corridors radiated like the spokes of a wheel. People began calling it the Sky Fortress. The name pleased him. He carved it into a seal of black steatite, pressed it into wet clay, and locked it in his treasury. But as the last bricks dried, as the scaffolds came down and the banners rose, he felt only a strange hollowness. He had achieved the impossible, and yet he sensed that the true battle had not even begun. Because building walls was easy, keeping what lived inside them alive, that was the work of eternity. The fortress rose like a mirage at the edge of the world. What had once been a scattering of mud-brick warehouses and reed huts was now a geometry of power etched into the desert's flesh. Double walls enclosed a perfect square. Each wall stood taller than two men, faced with sun-hardened bricks that glowed like copper at dawn. 4 gates pierced the walls at the cardinal points, guarded by towers with slit windows like unblinking eyes. Inside stretched a maze of T-shaped corridors, long storage halls and inner courtyards where the dust never settled. To travelers approaching from the steppe, it seemed less a city than an apparition, an order imposed on chaos by sheer will. The people called it the Sky Fortress, and at its heart stood the man who had summoned it from dust, the Lord of Dashley. He moved through the unfinished corridors like a shadow, silent except for the soft rasp of his sandals on baked clay. His builders had begun calling him the Still One because he rarely spoke and never raised his voice. But he saw everything. He measured bricks with his own hands, checked the depth of the mortar, traced the lines of shadow across the walls as the sun rose and fell. He had ordered the corridors to align with the cardinal winds, so the fortress breathed like a living thing. At dawn, cold air swept through the eastern gate and out the western halls. At dusk, the current reversed, carrying the smell of cooling stone. It pleased him. It made him feel that the fortress was alive and that he was its soul. Power was not yet his by blood or birthright. It was something he had forged, grain by grain, like the bricks themselves. He had created an empire of obligations. Each farmer owed him a portion of barley. Each trader owed him a toll. Each artisan worked in his name and marked their goods with his seal. Every seal impression was like a heartbeat, spreading the pulse of his authority outward through the caravan roads. He understood something most men never grasped, that power was not about strength, but about systems. Invisible systems that could hold a city together long after its stones cracked. He began organizing the oasis like the inside of his fortress. At the center, the granaries rose, long vaulted halls lined with clay bins sealed in bitumen. Around them coiled the workshops, copper smelters, lapidaries grinding stones, potters firing red-burnished vessels, seal carvers hunched over tiny blocks of steatite. Beyond them stretched the fields, ribbed with canals like veins, where men bent under the sun and women gleaned with baskets of woven reed. Watchtowers stood at the outer ring, manned day and night. Every activity had its place, every place its overseer, every overseer sworn to him. The whole oasis became an extension of his will, like fingers moving at the impulse of a single mind. And yet, as order grew, so did silence. The fortress consumed him. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the creak of pulleys lifting bricks and the muffled thud of mallets. He stopped attending the seasonal feasts, stopped laughing, stopped listening to the songs of the shepherds who came down from the hills. When the elders petitioned him for water rights or grazing access, he spoke like stone, slow, cold, without expression. They bowed lower each season. Some whispered that he had become less man than idol, a spirit of the walls. He sometimes wondered if they were right. At night, when the workers slept and the oasis lay quiet beneath the stars, he climbed the unfinished towers. From there, the world spread out like a parchment map. To the north, the steppe rolled black and empty under the moon. To the south, the river gleamed like molten silver, looping through the dark. Around him, the fortress crouched like a slumbering beast. It should have filled him with triumph. Instead, it filled him with unease. It was too still, too perfect. He imagined what it would look like if abandoned, walls crumbling, doors hanging open, the wind howling through corridors filled with sand. The image haunted him like a premonition. He clenched the battlements until his knuckles went white, as if he could hold the city in place by sheer force. He began to fear stillness as much as he once feared chaos. Movement became his talisman. He drove his builders to finish the fortifications, then ordered new ones. Outer walls, secondary gates, an inner citadel raised atop a mudbrick platform like a throne above the plain. He commanded canals dug deeper, lined with stone to resist the shifting river. He summoned more caravans, more merchants, more tribute. The fortress swelled like a living heart, pumping wealth and labor through its walls. But with each layer he added, he felt more hollow inside, like the eye of a growing storm. The people saw only the surface. Prosperity. Caravans crowded the gates, bringing lapis from Badakhshan, tin from Elam, turquoise from the eastern deserts, gold from lands no one could name. Markets bloomed in the outer courtyard, stalls heavy with beads and bolts of dyed wool, baskets of dates and figs, copper blades that glinted like fire. The smell of roasting lamb and fermented mare's milk filled the air. Travelers spoke in a dozen tongues, their words braided into a single hum of commerce. Dashley had become the beating heart of the Oxus trade routes. But the Lord of Dashley saw the cracks. He saw the merchants weighing coins with eyes too sharp, the local clans muttering over wine, the guards growing rich and careless. He saw the river shifting its banks a hand's breadth each season, gnawing at the canals. He saw the nomads watching from the northern hills, their horses restless, their faces blank. He saw the ghosts of cities that had once stood on the same earth and now lay buried in sand. He alone seemed to remember that all things fall, so he tightened control. He created a council of stewards, men loyal only to him, to oversee every aspect of life. They tracked every grain in the granaries, every animal in the herds, every shipment in the markets. They carved seals and recorded impressions on clay tablets, stacking them like bricks in his archives. He ordered public ceremonies where he sat on a raised dais beneath a white canopy, while the people offered gifts, grain, wool, lapis, incense. It was meant to inspire loyalty, but he watched their faces as they knelt, and he saw not reverence but fear. Somehow that pleased him. Fear was stronger than love. Fear lasted longer. Yet in the quiet hours, he wondered what they would do when fear faded. He began to understand the paradox of power. The higher he built, the further he drifted from everything human. He no longer walked the markets, no longer spoke to the farmers, no longer touched the river with his hands. He lived in the fortress like a man entombed while still alive. Sometimes when he stood in the central courtyard at dusk, the sun painting the walls blood red, he felt as if he had stepped outside of time. Nothing moved. Even the air held its breath. It should have been peace. Instead, it felt like death. And so the Lord of Dashley stood at the center of a miracle of his own making, a fortress that defied the desert, a city that pulsed with wealth, an order that bound thousands of lives. He had become what he once dreamed, unassailable, indispensable, almost divine. But deep within, he knew the truth that no one else dared speak. Stone endures, but men do not. And if the man crumbled, how long before the stones followed? The first time he saw her, the world seemed to fall silent. Not the bustling courtyards or the clatter of hooves at the gates. Those sounds still filled the air. But within him, a sudden hollow opened, like the hush before an eclipse. She stepped down from her chariot with the slow precision of ritual, her bare feet sinking into the pale dust as if the earth had softened for her. Silver bells chimed at her ankles, their music threading through the heat. Her eyes were the color of dark water. Around her neck hung a crescent of polished lapis lazuli, glowing like frozen sky. The people whispered her title, Moonborn of Gonor. She had come as part of an envoy from the oasis of Gonor Tepe, the largest and oldest city of the Oxus realm, where temples rose like white teeth above the desert, and priests claimed to speak for the gods. Her presence was an honor and a warning. The priestly clans of Gonor did not travel lightly. They came with a retinue of guards, dancers, and scribes, and they brought gifts, carved alabaster vessels, bronze mirrors, baskets of frankincense from far southern coasts. They came not to kneel, but to measure. To weigh the new fortress of Dashley in the balance of the sacred order. The Lord of Dashley received them in the central courtyard, seated on a raised platform draped with linen. He wore the seal of black steatite at his breast, the mark of his authority. Yet as she approached, he felt its weight vanish. She did not bow. She simply stood before him, still as the moon in a dark sky, and for an instant he felt small again, like the barefoot boy on the canal bank staring at the distant caravans. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her silence was more eloquent than any words. That night he could not sleep. He walked the perimeter of the fortress beneath the stars, the walls glowing faintly with moonlight, and thought of her. He told himself it was politics. If Gonor sent its priestess here, it meant they saw Dashley as worthy of alliance. He would secure that alliance, bind it in blood if he must. Yet deep inside, something else had begun to stir, something older than politics, a hunger not of conquest but of connection. The envoy stayed for 13 days. Each day she performed rites in the courtyard at dawn, burning fragrant resins on clay altars, scattering powdered malachite in spirals, singing low chants that seemed to vibrate through the stone. The people gathered in silence, drawn as if by gravity. Even the merchants hushed their quarrels. The Lord watched from the shadows of a colonnade, his heart beating too fast. She seemed to belong to a world beyond walls, beyond decay, a world that did not fear time. On the 14th day, she came to him. He had retreated to the upper terrace, the highest point of the fortress, where he often stood alone to watch the desert. The air was thin and cold, smelling of baked dust and distant rain. She stepped from the stairwell without sound, the moon pendant at her throat catching the sun. He did not speak, neither did she. They stood side by side, gazing at the empty horizon. At last she said, "Your walls are strong, but walls are bones. They need flesh." Then she left, leaving only the faint scent of myrrh. Her words struck like a blade hidden in silk. Flesh. He had built the bones of power, walls, canals, granaries, seals, but they were hollow. Flesh meant spirit, ritual, fear and faith woven together until men forgot how to imagine life beyond these walls. It was something he had always sensed but never named. Now she had named it. The next day he sent envoys to Goner with an offer of marriage. The priests debated for 3 months. She was their moonborn, consecrated to their oldest rites. To give her in marriage to a mortal lord was dangerous. Yet they saw what he had built, how Dashley rose like a new star in the desert sky, and they understood power as clearly as he did. They agreed. She returned at the head of a great procession, veiled in white linen, bearing torches lit from the sacred hearth of Goner. When she entered the fortress gates, the people fell to their knees. When she crossed the threshold of his inner sanctum, he did as well. Their union was not soft. It was cold, ceremonial, carved from stone. They spoke little at first. She spent her days in the moon chamber he built for her at the eastern corner of the fortress, a round hall of pale plaster open to the sky, where she tracked the lunar cycles and conducted rites at each phase. He spent his in the granaries and archives, moving seals and tallies like pieces on a game board. Yet slowly something began to change. She did not try to tame him. She shaped him. She showed him how symbols could outlive force, how fear could bind more tightly than chains, but reverence could bind tighter still. She taught him to choreograph the rhythms of power, when to appear in public like a god, when to vanish like mist, when to grant mercy like sudden rain, when to strike like lightning. She taught him how to weave terror and awe into the same fabric. Under her guidance, the ceremonies of Dashley became grand theater. Processions wound through the corridors at new moons, priests scattering silver dust, while masked dancers mimed the creation of the world. At full moons, he sat enthroned in the central courtyard, while the people poured out their tributes before him, and she crowned him with a silver circlet shaped like a crescent, her hands steady as stone. Together they transformed the fortress from a machine into a myth. He began to love her, not with the hunger of youth, but with something heavier, like gravity. It was not warmth, it was certainty. When she walked beside him through the corridors, the air seemed to settle. When she spoke, even briefly, his thoughts sharpened as if the words were whetstones. She was not his possession, she was his axis. Without her, everything would spin apart. The people felt this too. They began to speak of them as a single being, the Sun Lord and the Moon Bride. Merchants carved their emblems side by side on their goods. Farmers whispered her name in the fields, asking the moon to fatten their crops. Even the soldiers muttered charms, invoking her silver light to protect their patrols. Fear still ruled, but now it walked hand in hand with devotion. Dashley had become more than a fortress. It was becoming sacred. For a time, he almost believed it would last forever. He would stand on the upper terrace at night, her presence warm at his side, and watch the moon pour silver across the walls. The fortress gleamed like a living thing. Below, the courtyards thrummed with the life of markets and workshops, the laughter of children, the distant clang of hammers. The air smelled of grain and incense and river silt. He would close his eyes and breathe it in, and for a fleeting moment he felt not hollow but whole. Yet even in those moments, the desert still whispered. It whispered of cities older than his, whose walls had fallen. It whispered of rivers that changed their paths like snakes, leaving ruins stranded on dry plains. It whispered that bones, however strong, crumble, and flesh rots, and names vanish like smoke. Sometimes he wondered if she heard it too. She never said. She only watched the moon, serene and untouchable, as if time itself bowed to her. In his heart, he knew it did not. But he no longer cared, for now the moon shone on Dashley, and the desert stayed silent. For now he was not alone. The caravans never stopped. They came from the north with horsehide sacks of salt and painted steppe ponies that stamped the ground like drums. They came from the east with turquoise stones wrapped in goat leather and wool dyed in impossible shades of indigo. They came from the south bearing frankincense from forgotten coasts, and from the west with copper ingots that shone like captured sunsets. From dawn to dusk, the gates of Dashley churned with motion. Wheels creaked, hooves clattered, bells chimed. Dust rose in veils that glowed gold in the morning sun. The fortress pulsed like a heart, and the Lord of Dashley sat at its center, watching the lifeblood flow. His vision had worked. The fortress was no longer a frontier outpost, but a city in truth, a node that stitched the scattered worlds of the Oxus together. The courtyards thundered with the clang of bronze being hammered into blades, the hiss of potters opening their kilns, the rhythmic slap of looms weaving linen as fine as spider silk. Warehouses groaned with jars of barley, amphorae of fermented milk, baskets of figs sealed in bitumen. The air itself seemed to hum with wealth, a low vibration that trembled through the mudbrick walls and into the bones of those who lived within them. Yet the more the city thrived, the less he slept. He would lie awake in the cold hours before dawn, listening to the faint sounds of life drifting up from the courtyards. A camel snorting in its sleep, a baby's thin cry, a guard's spear butt tapping the flagstones. And beneath it all, he would hear something else, a silence pressing from beyond the walls, vast and patient. The desert, waiting. He had feared chaos once, when the fortress was young and fragile. Now he feared stillness. If the caravans stopped, even for a season, the lifeblood would clot, and Dashley would wither like a severed limb. He had built something magnificent, but he knew its secret. It could not stand still. It had to move, to grow, to devour. If it stopped, it would die. So he drove it faster. He expanded the markets, doubled the tribute levies, dispatched his guards as escorts for caravans to distant oases. He sent emissaries to Elamite merchants, offering safe passage for their tin convoys if they would route them through Dashley. He sent spies east toward the lands of the Indus, to learn which settlements were rising, which were faltering. He ordered new workshops built along the outer wall, so close to the gates that the smell of molten copper hung in the air like blood. He turned the fortress into a forge, and he was the hammer. The people called it an age of glory. Lapis and gold gleamed in their temples. Their children wore beads of carnelian around their throats. Their storerooms overflowed with grain. But beneath the glitter, fissures spread like cracks under frost. The local clans muttered that the levies were crushing their fields, that their sons were being sent too far as caravan guards and returning with step-borne scars. The merchants grumbled that his tolls bled them even as they grew rich. Even the soldiers, once fierce with loyalty, now swaggered through the markets with the arrogance of men who had forgotten fear. His city was growing too fast, faster than any one man could control. And beyond the northern hills, the Andronovo watched. They were ghosts at first, shapes glimpsed at the edge of sight. Riders on small, powerful horses, bows slung across their backs, hair braided with bone. They did not attack. They circled. They appeared on distant ridgelines at dusk, watching as the sun bled out behind the walls, then vanished into the grasslands. The traders whispered of them in the markets, voices tight. The steppe tribes had grown bold, they said. They raided the caravan routes between Margiana and the mountains, burned the watchtowers of lesser oases, slaughtered whole herding camps and took their children. They were no longer scattered bands. They were becoming something more. The Lord of Dashley watched them from the towers through narrow slits of stone, the wind howling around him, and felt the old knot tighten in his chest. He remembered the nights of his youth when he feared the desert swallowing all he built. Now he feared it coming alive and striking back. He began to see betrayal everywhere. He dismissed 3 of his stewards for alleged theft, though no proof was found. He ordered his council to conduct surprise audits of every workshop, every granary, every guard post. He doubled the watch shifts, sealed the city gates at sundown, forbade merchants from entering the inner citadel. He even ordered the sacred moon chamber locked for 3 nights, claiming the guards needed to search for spies. The people murmured that he had gone mad. Perhaps he had. His wife, the Moonborn, watched in silence. She had become the still heart of Dashley, her rituals the rhythm that marked the city's time. On new moons, she lit fires of fragrant wood that smoked blue in the night, and the people gathered in silence while she scattered silver dust into the air. On full moons, she crowned him with the crescent circlet and anointed his forehead with perfumed oil, her hands steady as always. She never challenged him before the people, but when they were alone, she spoke. "You are building a cage," she told him one night, her voice as calm as a still water. "And you are locking yourself inside it." He said nothing. He stared at the floor where the moonlight fell through the lattice like pale bars. He wanted to tell her that the world was sharpening its teeth, that softness would be eaten alive. He wanted to tell her that fear was the only mortar that held power together. But the words tangled in his throat, because part of him knew she was right. She touched his arm lightly. "Fear burns fast," she said. "It leaves ashes, and nothing grows from ashes." Then she left him standing alone in the cold moonlight. For a few days he tried to listen. He relaxed the market levies, reopened the moon chamber, even joined her at a dawn ritual for the first time in years. The people murmured approval. He felt something inside him loosen, a hint of the man he had once been, the boy who dreamed of walls to hold the world together. But then a caravan was ambushed on the northern route. 40 guards slain, their wagons burned, their cargo stolen. The survivors said they had seen banners painted with a black sun, the mark of the Andronovo. Something inside him broke. He called the council at midnight, their faces pale in the torchlight, and announced that Dashley was at war. He ordered new forges opened to produce spearheads and arrowheads day and night. He conscripted every able-bodied youth from the surrounding villages, dragging them from their families with barely time for farewells. He raised the walls higher, built new watchtowers, stockpiled grain in sealed vaults. The fortress became a machine of war, its breath a rasp of iron and dust. The markets faltered. Merchants began to bypass Dashley, fearful of the rising tension, the unpredictable tolls, the soldiers prowling the streets. The courtyards grew quieter. Fear had returned, just as he wished, and yet it felt like rot spreading through the bones of his city. He stopped speaking to his wife. She continued her rituals, her face serene, but the space between them grew like a crack in stone. At night he walked the ramparts alone, staring into the black hills where the steppe began, imagining the Andronovo watching him from the darkness. Sometimes he thought he saw faint glimmers of firelight far away, and his stomach twisted with a cold certainty that they were out there, waiting for the moment when fear curdled into collapse. The desert wind howled across the plain like a beast. He gripped the battlements until his knuckles bled and whispered a vow to the darkness, that Dashley would not fall, that he would burn the world to keep it standing if he must. Far below, in the moon chamber, his wife knelt alone before the cold hearth, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed. She did not pray for victory. She prayed that when the fire came, it would leave something alive in its ashes. The river betrayed him. It began as a whisper of unease, the water running shallower than usual in the spring melt, the fish scarce, the reeds along the banks turning brittle. The farmers muttered that the snows had been thin in the mountains, that the gods were testing their resolve. He dismissed it. Rivers rose and fell. Dashley was strong. Dashley would endure. Then the canals began to dry. The fields cracked under the sun, the young barley curling into gray husk before it ripened. The irrigation ditches turned to mud, then to dust. Herds grew gaunt, their ribs pressed through their hides like the beams of abandoned roofs. The wind carried not the smell of green things, but the scorched tang of burning salt. Day by day, the river receded from its banks like a wounded animal crawling away to die. The granaries became tombs. At first, he treated it as a problem to be solved. He ordered rationing, cutting the people's grain allotments in half, then in half again. He commanded the construction of deeper wells, though the water they reached was bitter and fouled with salt. He dispatched caravans to distant oases to buy food, but most never returned. Those that did came back half empty, their guards hollow-eyed, their wagons crawling with flies. The drought had not spared the other cities. It had devoured them all. The people began to starve. They crowded the fortress gates at dawn, faces gray with dust and hunger, holding out withered hands. The guards beat them back with staves. At night the air echoed with the thin cries of children. The smell of death drifted through the streets like incense from a ruined shrine. In the fields beyond the walls, corpses lay among the stubble, already half buried in blown sand. The Lord of Dashley watched from the terrace, his face carved from stone. He stopped walking the markets. There were no markets left. The stalls stood empty, their awnings torn by wind, the ground beneath them littered with gnawed bones. The workshops had gone silent, the forges cold. The fortress still stood, its walls straight, its towers tall, but inside it everything had gone still. It felt to him like standing inside a great animal that had already died, its heart no longer beating, though its body had not yet fallen. He would not let it fall. He turned the fortress into a prison of survival. Guards sealed the city gates, allowed no one to leave without his seal. He ordered mass searches of the homes for hidden food. Any hoarded grain was seized for the central storehouses. Theft was punished by amputation, then by death. He commanded the granary doors sealed with bitumen and stationed armed men at every entrance. He walked the rows of clay bins himself, running his fingers over their cool sides as if to reassure himself they were still full. The silence inside those halls was immense, broken only by the faint rustle of rats. He dreamed of rats. At night he sat alone on the floor of the central granary, the smell of old grain thick in his nostrils, staring into the darkness. Sometimes he thought he heard voices whispering from the clay bins. Sometimes he whispered back. He told himself he was not cruel, only necessary. If the city survived, they would bless him for his severity. If it died, they would curse him no matter what he had done. Better to live and be hated than to die and be pitied. Still, the dead piled up. They stacked like cordwood at the edge of the city. The guards burned them at first, but the smoke made the people wail and claw at the air, so he forbade burning. Instead, they dug mass graves in the dry canal beds, wide trenches that swallowed the bodies like cracked mouths. The earth there was soft and black, as it had been when he was a child, but now it reeked of decay. His wife, the Moonborn, begged him to stop. She came to him in the granary one night, her white robes gray with dust, her hair unbound, her crescent pendant dull with ash. Her voice was quiet but sharp as flint. She told him the people were dying not only of hunger, but of despair, that they had begun to say the gods had abandoned Dashley, that his cruelty had driven away the moon's blessing. She pleaded with him to show mercy, to open the stores, to feed the children at least, to give the dying something softer than the lash. He listened, motionless. His hands rested on his knees like blocks of stone. When she finished, he said nothing. Only his eyes moved, sweeping the rows of sealed clay bins towering around them like silent witnesses. She knelt before him. She had never done that before. Her voice cracked. "If you rule only bones," she whispered, "what will remain of you when the flesh is gone?" For a moment he almost yielded. He saw, as if from a great distance, the man he had once been, the boy on the canal bank dreaming of walls to hold the world together, not to cage it. He felt the old longing to be more than feared. He wanted desperately to believe that compassion could still save what fear had not. Then he remembered the black sun painted on the banners of the Andronovo. He remembered the empty eyes of the caravans that had not returned. He remembered that if Dashley fell, nothing would remain but sand. He rose to his feet and turned away. He told her to leave the granary. She stood slowly, like a shadow lifting from the floor, and walked out without looking back. The sound of her footsteps faded into the silence like the last echo of something living. The next morning he ordered the gates closed permanently. No one entered. No one left. Dashley became a sealed tomb, and he became its warden. Days bled into weeks. The sky stayed clear and pitiless. The sun, a white nail hammered into the world. The people stopped gathering at the gates. They stopped crying. They stopped moving. The city sank into a silence so deep it felt like the breath had been sucked out of the air. One dawn he walked the inner courtyards and saw no one. Not a guard, not a scribe, not even a rat. Only dust moving like thin smoke in the wind. The walls loomed around him, flawless, immense, as if nothing had changed. But he could feel it. The city was hollow now, a shell of baked clay. When he pressed his palm to the wall, it was warm from the sun, but beneath that warmth it was cold, dead cold. That night he descended alone into the canal beds where the mass graves lay. The moon was thin and sickly, casting a pale green light on the earth. The trenches were half filled with sand now. Bone shards jutted from the drifts like splinters of old wood. The smell was faint but clung to his throat like rancid oil. He stood there for a long time, staring at the place where his people had become soil, and he felt nothing. No sorrow, no rage, not even guilt. Only a cold, vast emptiness, as if something inside him had burned out and left only ash. When he returned to the fortress, the Moonborn was gone. Her moon chamber stood dark, the hearth cold, the silver dustpots overturned. No one had seen her leave. Perhaps she had fled to Goner. Perhaps she had walked into the desert to let the sands bury her bones. Perhaps she had simply ceased to exist. He did not search for her. He sat on the terrace at dawn, the sky bruised with the first light, and watched the empty city below. The fortress still stood. The walls still gleamed. The granaries were still full. And yet there was nothing left to rule but bones. They came with the wind. For weeks there had been whispers, traders glimpsing dark shapes on the northern ridges, shepherds finding scorched earth where their camps had stood, a lone scout returning half-mad with tales of horsemen who moved like smoke. Then one dawn, as the sun clawed above the desert like a bloodied hand, the horizon caught fire. The Andronovo had come. They poured down from the hills in a black tide, their ponies foaming, their banners painted with the black sun he had seen in his nightmares. They screamed like hunting hawks, voices raw, and the earth shuddered beneath their hooves. Behind them rolled smoke, the charred remains of the outer villages, the fields, the watchtowers. The sky darkened not with clouds but with ash. The Lord of Dashley stood on the northern tower, the wind tearing at his robes, and watched the world he had built ignite. He did not move, not at first. He felt nothing, no fear, no rage, not even surprise. It was as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life, the moment the desert finally struck back. Then the drums began to beat. Their dull thunder rolled through the fortress like a second heartbeat. The gates slammed shut, the bolts dropped into their sockets. The defenders scrambled to the walls. Arrows clattered into the stone, their black shafts quivering. Spears bristled over the battlements. The Andronovo circled the fortress like wolves, loosing fire-tipped arrows that arced through the sky and shattered against the mudbrick in showers of sparks. The smell of pitch and burning hair filled the air. He descended from the tower like a ghost and walked the walls. The soldiers shrank back as he passed. His eyes were empty, the eyes of a man who had nothing left to lose. He spoke no orders, only raised his arm toward the enemy, and the archers loosed their volleys in silence. Bronze-tipped shafts hissed through the air, striking flesh with wet cracks. Horses screamed, men tumbled into the dust. But for every rider who fell, two more appeared. They moved like water, flowing around the fortress, never stopping, their hooves drumming like distant thunder. The siege had begun. For 7 days and nights the Andronovo harried the walls. They drove stolen cattle ahead of them, then slaughtered the beasts and flung their burning carcasses against the gates. They lashed flaming brush to their arrows and rained fire on the outer roofs. They dragged battering rams from the wreckage of the villages and hurled them at the walls until their shoulders bled. Dashley held. The double walls did what he had designed them to do. The outer ramparts absorbed the blows, their sun-hardened bricks shrugging off the impact. The inner walls loomed untouched behind them, like clenched jaws. The T-shaped corridors funneled the attackers into narrow kill zones where his archers cut them down. The canals, though dry, still formed moats of steep-walled dust that broke the charge of their horses. The fortress did not falter, but inside something else was breaking. There was no food. The granaries were sealed, their guards posted with drawn blades. The people crouched in their homes like animals, lips cracked, bellies shrunken. The wells were nearly dry. The smell of rot seeped from the infirmaries. Each dawn brought more dead, soldiers from the walls, children from hunger, elders from despair. The dead were dragged to the canals and thrown into the half-buried graves without rites. The living watched in silence, their eyes flat. He watched from the terrace, unmoving. He no longer felt hunger. He no longer felt anything. He had become an instrument, a machine built for one purpose, to keep the walls standing. He walked the battlements by night, his steps soundless on the stone, his shadow sliding over the exhausted defenders. He slept in his armor. He spoke only in gestures. He was not a man now, but the fortress itself, animated by something colder than life. Yet even machines wear down. By the second week, the Andronovo changed their tactics. They stopped attacking the walls. They began striking the supply routes, ambushing the last desperate caravans that tried to break through the siege. They poisoned the wells outside the gates. They rode out at dusk and set the dry fields ablaze, and at night the sky glowed red as if the earth itself were bleeding. The heat pressed down like a hammer. The wind carried cinders that stung the eyes like sand. Inside Dashley, the people began to turn on one another. Families raided each other's homes for scraps. Soldiers deserted their posts to break into the grain vaults. The guards cut them down in the courtyards, leaving their bodies where they fell. The streets filled with flies. The air tasted of metal and ash. Even the sacred moon chamber, long abandoned since she vanished, was broken into and stripped bare, its silver dust scattered, its plaster walls smeared with soot. Still he did not speak her name. He had not spoken it since the night she left. He carried her absence like a brand pressed into his flesh, hidden but always burning. Sometimes he thought he saw her shape in the smoke, her pale robes drifting along the walls, her dark eyes watching from the shadows. He never followed. If she was a ghost, she had come to witness his ruin. If she was a dream, she had come to remind him what he had lost. By the third week, the Andronovo finally struck in full. They came at dusk, when the sun bled low behind the walls and the defenders' shadows stretched long and thin. They drove flaming wagons against the northern gate, the wheels screaming as they struck. The battering rams came again, shrouded in wet hides to resist fire, their iron tips slamming into the bricks with the sound of cracking bones. Arrows fell like rain. The sky went black with smoke. He stood at the center of the gatehouse, silent, and raised his hand. The defenders unleashed everything. Pitch, boiling water, stones heaved from the ramparts. Spears flashed like lightning. The air turned into a furnace of heat and screams. The Andronovo howled and surged forward, clambering over their dead, hacking at the gates with bronze axes until their hands were slick with blood. Then the gates cracked. A sound like the snapping spine of the world rang through the fortress. The outer doors burst inward in a roar of splinters, and the Andronovo poured through like fire through dry grass. He did not retreat. He strode into the breach. For a moment the world narrowed to the clash of bronze on bone, the hot iron taste of blood in the air. He moved like a man already dead, his blade a black arc in the firelight. Men fell around him like stalks before a scythe. The defenders rallied, screaming, surging forward. They slammed the inner gate shut just as the Andronovo hurled their rams against it. The courtyard floor was slick with blood. The dead lay in tangled heaps, their mouths open like broken urns, and still the fortress stood. By dawn the Andronovo had retreated, dragging their wounded through the smoke. The northern gate was gone, reduced to blackened rubble, but the inner walls still loomed. Dashley had survived, barely. He stood alone amid the corpses, the sunrise painting the blood in molten gold, and felt nothing. Not victory, not relief, only exhaustion so deep it felt like drowning. He looked up at the fortress walls, their bricks scorched and pitted, and saw them as they truly were. Not teeth, but gravestones. He had won. And yet, even as the wind howled over the empty fields, he knew it was only the first storm. The Andronovo would return. The drought would not break. The city was bleeding out, even if the heart still beat. Somewhere far off beyond the hills, the black sun banners fluttered in the rising heat. Waiting, watching. He turned away from the gate, his armor stiff with dried blood, and walked back into the fortress that had become his tomb. she returned like a ghost. It was deep winter when the sentries saw her, a pale figure moving alone across the black plain at dawn. The sky was colorless, the air sharp as flint. She wore no cloak, only the same white robes she had worn the day she vanished, though they hung loose now, torn and gray with dust. The crescent of lapis at her throat was cracked down the center. She made no sound as she passed through the shattered northern gate, stepping over the bones of men and horses as if they were stones in a dry riverbed. No one stopped her. No one dared. The people watched from the shadows as she walked the ruined streets. Their faces were hollow, their eyes glassy with hunger. Yet something flickered in them, a glimmer of memory, of reverence, of the world before it burned. She crossed the central courtyard without looking at them, without looking at anything, as though the city no longer existed. Only when she reached the base of the inner terrace did she pause, lifting her eyes to the highest tower where he stood. For the first time in many seasons, the Lord of Dashley felt his heart beat. He descended the stair in silence. His armor hung from him like dead weight. His beard was streaked with ash, his eyes sunken. He had not expected her. He had not dared to. In his mind she had dissolved into the desert like mist. Yet here she was, walking toward him through the ruins of the city they had built together, her steps light, soundless, inexorable. They met in the shadow of the terrace. Neither spoke. She stood very still, her eyes darker than he remembered. And for a moment the years peeled away, and he saw her as she had been, the moon-born, radiant, untouchable, crowned in silver dust beneath the cold stars. Then the wind shifted, and he smelled her. Not incense, not myrrh, dust, old water, and something sour beneath it. The smell of a grave left open too long. She swayed. He caught her before she fell. Her body was weightless, bird-bone fragile. He carried her up the stair to the moon chamber, though it had long since been gutted by looters. Its hearth was cold, its plaster walls streaked with soot, its silver dust scattered like ashes. He laid her on the stone dais where she had once anointed him as ruler of Dashley. Her skin was cold as the stone itself. She opened her eyes once. He saw no anger there, no reproach, only a vast exhaustion, like the calm at the bottom of a well. Her lips moved. He bent close. "Nothing grows," she whispered. Then she closed her eyes. By dawn she was dead. He did not summon the priests. There were no priests left. He did not call the people to mourn. They had no mourning left in them. He sat alone beside her body for 3 days and nights, unmoving, as if carved from the same stone as the dais. The wind blew through the shattered windows and drifted dust over her pale face. Her crescent pendant slipped from her throat and cracked against the floor. He did not pick it up. On the 4th day he rose. He ordered the moon chamber sealed. He summoned what few builders remained and commanded them to raise a tower above it, white plastered, smooth as bone, so tall it pierced the sky like a spear. He brought out the last of the silver from the treasury and had it beaten into sheets, which he nailed to the upper walls so they would catch the sun by day and the moon by night. The people watched in silence as it rose, a ghostly spire gleaming over the black ruins, visible for miles across the desert. It became known as the Tower of the Moon. He visited it only once. He climbed to its summit at twilight, the wind howling like wolves around him, and stood looking down at the city. The roofs were sunken, the courtyards empty, the canals filled with sand. Fires flickered faintly in the distance, where the last families huddled. Beyond the walls, the desert stretched infinite and silent, broken only by the faint smudge of the Andronovo camps on the horizon. He felt nothing, no grief, no rage, not even loss, as if her death had drained the last blood from his heart and left only cold. She had been the last living thing he loved, the last tether binding him to the world of flesh. Without her, there was only stone, and he was stone now. He did not descend the tower by the stairs. He climbed down the outer wall barefoot, his fingers clawing the plaster like talons. When he reached the ground, his feet were bleeding. He did not notice. He walked barefoot across the cold flagstones back to the inner citadel, leaving a trail of red footprints that dried black by morning. After that, he stopped speaking. Weeks passed. The siege dragged on. The Andronovo struck and retreated, like wolves testing a dying bull. The defenders thinned with each attack. The people no longer cried when their kin were taken by hunger. They only dragged the bodies to the graves and returned to their silence. The fortress smelled of smoke and saltless sweat and old blood. He moved through it like a ghost. He appeared on the walls at dawn, a black shape against the white sky, his hair whipping like tattered cloth. He stood there for hours without moving, while the sentries shifted nervously around him. Sometimes he walked the corridors at night with a lamp, its flame guttering in the wind, pausing to run his fingers along the cracked plaster as though memorizing it. He slept in the archives among the clay tablets, though he no longer read them. They gathered dust around him like dry leaves. Some whispered he had gone mad. Some said he was already dead and only his shadow remained. No one dared speak to him. The tower of the moon gleamed above the city, pale and terrible. By day it flashed like a blade in the sun. By night it shone like a shard of frozen starlight, its silver plates catching the moon. It became a beacon the starving people could see from anywhere within the walls, yet none dared approach. They said the moon-born spirit walked its heights, her hollow eyes weeping silver tears that never reached the ground. They said she watched the city with sorrow, waiting for it to end. He never looked at it. He forbade her name to be spoken. He ordered the old murals of her face smashed, her sigil scraped from the seal stones, her name burned from the records. The Sun Lord stood alone now, and the moon had turned to ash. The city followed. Shops and workshops closed, their doors nailed shut. The markets died. The last caravans were gone, swallowed by the steppe. The streets lay buried in drifts of dust. Rats nested in the cracks of the once perfect granaries. The fortress walls, though still immense, were spined with fissures, their bricks crumbling like old teeth. Yet he still walked them, every night, barefoot and silent, his blood drying in black threads on the stone. He was not defending the city anymore. He was haunting it. The river turned away. It happened quietly, almost gently, like a lover slipping from a bed in the dark. One morning, the sentries reported that the northern branch had dropped so low that the water no longer reached the upper fields. By the second week, the canals were dry hollows veined with salt. By the third, the river itself had curved west, carving a new path through the sand, leaving Dashley stranded like a carcass on the plain. There was no roar, no flood, no final violence, just silence. The river had chosen another world and left him behind. He watched from the terrace as the last glint of water vanished beyond the dunes. He said nothing. The wind pressed against his face like cold hands. In his mind, he saw the first day he had come here, a boy full of fire, standing on the same spot imagining fields, spreading like green cloth beneath the walls. Now the fields were gray skeletons of stalks rattling in the wind. Beyond them, dunes crept toward the fortress like slow waves. The heart of his city had been water. Now it had no heart. Without the river, the caravans stopped coming. The last traders who had braved the siege arrived to find only ash and ruin. They stood at the gates in stunned silence, staring at the cracked streets, the hollow-eyed survivors. The silver tower of the Moonborn gleaming above the rubble like a shard of bone. Then they turned their wagons and vanished into the horizon without a word. They did not look back. The markets died first. Their stalls collapsed under their own weight. Their awnings rotted to threads, their signs hanging crooked in the wind. Then the workshops fell silent. The copper forges cooled. The kilns cracked. The looms sagged like spiderwebs abandoned by their spiders. The great granaries stood like empty skulls, their clay bins echoing with the scrabble of rats. Dashley was hollowing from within. The people began to flee. First in trickles, families slipping out at night, barefoot, carrying what little grain they could bind in cloth. Then in streams, whole streets emptying in a single day. Their doors left open, their hearths still warm. They left offerings at the base of the Tower of the Moon, wilted flowers, broken beads, bits of baked bread, as if begging her spirit to forgive their desertion. The next morning the wind had scattered it all into the dust. He forbade them to leave. He stationed guards at the gates, ordered deserters whipped and their belongings burned. It did not matter. The people kept going. The guards eventually joined them. One morning he climbed the north wall and saw a column of figures moving across the dunes, thin and black against the bright sand, stretching to the horizon like an exodus of shadows. He watched until they disappeared. He did not call them back. He no longer believed they could hear him. He was alone long before the city was empty. The fortress did not fall in battle. It eroded. Cracks crawled through the walls like veins of rot. The plaster peeled in long gray strips. The wind found seams in the masonry and sang through them in hollow whispers. Sand drifted knee-deep in the courtyards, bearing the mosaics of bulls and crescents, filling the footprints of the vanished. Even the Tower of the Moon had lost its shine. The silver sheets at its crown had tarnished black, so that by night it loomed like a burnt fang against the stars. Yet he still rebuilt. Every dawn he walked the walls barefoot, the soles of his feet cracked and bleeding, and marked the fissures with charcoal. By noon he was hauling bricks himself, his once princely hands clawed and raw. He mixed mud in cracked jars, packed it into gaps, hammered new timbers into splintering beams. He dragged fallen stones into piles, sorted them by size, stacked them into neat rows like soldiers awaiting inspection. The few hollow-eyed men who still lingered in the ruins sometimes watched from a distance, muttering that he had gone mad. They were wrong. He had gone beyond madness. He was trying to hold back time. He believed, no, he knew, that if he could keep the walls standing, everything else would return. The river would come back, snaking to him like a contrite servant. The caravans would reappear at the gates with bells chiming, their wheels cutting fresh lines through the sand. The markets would rise again, voices clashing like cymbals, the smell of roasting lamb thick in the air. The moonborn would descend her tower in robes white as new snow, her crescent whole again, her eyes full of light. All of it would come back, if only the walls did not fall. So he rebuilt. Even when his fingers bled and would no longer curl, he wrapped them in rags and kept going. Even when the sun blistered his skin until it peeled away like paper, he kept going. Even when he coughed blood and could not stand, he crawled on his hands and knees, dragging bricks behind him, like a dying beast dragging its own bones. The wind screamed through the broken windows, but he screamed louder, hammering the stone as if he could drive the world back into place through sheer force of will. At night he slept on the unfinished walls, curled like a dying animal, the stars spinning overhead like the points of a shattered wheel. He began to hear voices. They whispered from the cracks in the masonry, from the empty canals, from the hollow granaries. Sometimes they were the voices of his soldiers, laughing as they once had in the courtyards. Sometimes they were the voices of children, playing among the date palms that no longer existed. Sometimes they were her voice, low and cool as water, saying nothing but his name. He answered them. He spoke to the cracks, the dust, the wind. He told them the city was not dead, that they were only sleeping, that he would wake them when the walls were whole again. The walls did not answer. They only shed more dust. Weeks passed, or months. Time had no shape now, only a slow grinding like stones under water. The fortress was almost empty. The last of the people were gone, their homes dark, their hearths cold. Even the rats had abandoned the granaries. Only he remained, a gaunt figure, moving through the ruins, dragging stones through the sand, building walls no one would ever see. His hands had become claws, his skin parchment over bone. His eyes were two black hollows. He no longer ate, he no longer drank. He lived on dust and memory. He told himself he was saving Dashley. But some nights when the wind dropped and the silence roared in his ears, he admitted the truth. He was not rebuilding the city. He was entombing himself. He could not stop. The thought of stopping filled him with a terror beyond death. If he stopped, the silence would rush in like a flood and wash away even the thought of Dashley, leaving only sand. He could not bear it. Better to be buried alive than to vanish. Better to petrify himself into the walls than to be forgotten. So he kept building. He built as the moon waned and vanished. He built as the sun turned the stones to molten copper and the wind scoured his flesh to leather. He built as the seasons passed, though he could no longer tell them apart. He built until his body was only pain and his mind only the memory of motion. He built until the walls began to look like him, cracked, bloodless, and hollow. One dawn he climbed the Tower of the Moon. Its spiral stair had crumbled in places, and he crawled on his hands and knees, his breath wheezing like broken bellows. The air was thin and cold. At the summit he stood swaying, the wind clawing at his rags. The horizon was empty in every direction, no river, no people, no smoke from distant fires. Only the dunes, rolling away forever like the backs of sleeping beasts. For a moment he thought he saw her. She stood on the sand far below, robes white, crescent hole, her face turned up to him. Her lips moved, though he could not hear her. He reached out his hand. She dissolved into dust. He sank to his knees. His hands hung limp at his sides. The wind shrieked through the silver plates, now black with tarnish, and the sound was like laughter stripped of joy. He bowed his head against the cold stone of the tower, and for the first time in many seasons, he wept. The tears left tracks down his ash-streaked face, dark as blood. When they dried, he rose. He climbed down the tower one last time. At its base, the sand had already begun to pile against the walls, soft as snow, erasing the line where stone met earth. He watched the wind lift a curl of it, spinning it into the air like the ghost of a forgotten word. The walls stood, for now. But he knew, as he turned and walked barefoot across the dead courtyards, that they were not holding back time. They were only delaying its mercy. He no longer cast a shadow, or perhaps the sun had simply stopped trying to find him. It rose and fell beyond the walls in silence, shedding its gold on stone that no longer seemed to notice. Dust veiled the sky. Sand hissed through the streets like whispers. Dashley had stopped being a city. It was becoming a mirage, half air, half memory. So was he. The man who had once bent rivers to his will now drifted through the ruins like smoke, silent, weightless, half unreal. His flesh had thinned to parchment. His bones showed through his skin like the ribs of a starved horse. His beard was white, his hair brittle as straw. When he moved, the wind passed through him. When he spoke, which was rare, the words fell from his mouth like stones into a dry well and made no sound. He had become the thing he had feared most, forgotten while still alive. The city was almost empty now. Only a handful of souls remained, too weak or too stubborn to flee. They haunted the outer ruins like feral dogs, scavenging among the rubble, their eyes yellow and sunken. They did not approach him. They crossed themselves with trembling fingers when he passed, as if warding off an unquiet spirit. He did not blame them. He was not their lord anymore. He was not even human. He no longer remembered when he had last spoken his own name. It had become a taste he could not quite recall, like a fruit from childhood or a dream that dissolves when you open your eyes. Names were for the living. He was something else now, something caught between stone and air. Still, he walked the walls. Every dawn he rose from his bed of dust in the archives and climbed the stairs barefoot, his steps leaving no sound. The walls were splitting, their bricks shedding thin scales of clay that fluttered away like moths. He traced the cracks with a fingertip as if they were the veins of a dying body. He still carried a hammer at his waist, though he no longer used it. His hands trembled too much. He only touched the stones, gently, like stroking the flank of a sick animal, murmuring to them in a voice no one could hear. He told them they would outlast him. He told them they had to. But even the walls had begun to forget him. The fortress no longer seemed to recognize his footsteps. Doors stuck when he tried to open them, as if resisting his hand. The wind slammed shutters in his face. The sand filled in his footprints as he made them. It was as though the city was erasing him in real time, burying him grain by grain before he was gone. It should have broken him. It did not. There was nothing left to break. Only one thing remained of the man he had been: the seal. It was small, carved of black steatite, worn smooth by the years. It bore the emblem he had chosen in his youth, the four-pointed star flanked by twin bulls, symbol of the Sky Fortress. Once it had been the axis of his power. Every contract, every tribute, every law had been stamped with its mark. It had carried his will farther than his voice ever could. It had made him real. Now it felt like a lie. He carried it to the central hearth of the inner citadel, where once the sacred fire had burned, and knelt on the cracked tiles. Dust swirled in the shafts of light from the broken roof. He held the seal in his hands for a long time, feeling its weight, or rather its lack of it. It was so small, so light. He had built walls that touched the sky, filled granaries with mountains of grain, crushed armies, bent nations to his will. And all of it came down to this thumb-sized stone. He pressed it to his lips. It was cold. Then he dug into the hearth with his bare hands until his nails split and the blood ran black with ash. He carved a hollow deep enough to swallow it. He placed the seal inside, covered it with dust, pressed the stones back into place. He left no marker, no offering, no word. He buried not just the seal, he buried his name. That night he walked the city one last time. The moon was a thin scythe above the desert, pale and sharp. The wind had stilled, and the silence was so complete it seemed to press against his ears like water. He passed through the empty courtyards where once the markets had howled with color and song. He passed the workshops, now roofless, their floors veined with weeds that had clawed up through the cracks. He passed the granaries, their bins broken, their doors hanging open like slack mouths. He passed the Tower of the Moon. It was black now, its silver plates eaten away by wind, its white plaster streaked with soot. It loomed over the dead city like the last tooth in a jawbone. He stood at its base for a long time, staring up at its summit where she had once stood with the moon blazing behind her, her hands cool on his brow as she crowned him lord. He felt nothing, not grief, not love, not even longing, just distance. She had become part of the stone, and so had he. He climbed the outer wall. The stairs were half collapsed, and the bricks crumbled under his hands, but he reached the top as the first pale light bled along the horizon. He stood swaying, the wind tugging at his rags. Beyond the walls, the desert rolled away in endless gray waves. Far off, he could see faint trails of the last refugees, no more than black specks on the white sand, heading west toward the new course of the river. They did not look back. He watched until they vanished. Then he turned and walked the length of the wall, each step slow, deliberate, final. He touched the stones as he passed. They were warm from the rising sun. They did not stir. They did not remember him. When he reached the North Tower, he stopped. He stood there a long time, gazing out at nothing. At last he stepped down from the battlement, his feet leaving no prints in the dust. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the wall was empty. The Lord of Dashley was gone. No one saw where he went. No one ever found his body. Some said he walked into the desert and lay down where the dunes could cover him. Some said he climbed the Tower of the Moon and cast himself into the air, and the wind bore him away as dust. Some whispered that he simply dissolved, the city reclaiming him as it crumbled. Whatever the truth, only the walls remained, and even they were already beginning to fall. The desert was patient. Long after he disappeared, it went on with its slow work, the only kind of work it knew, erasure. The wind scoured the walls, shaving them grain by grain. The dunes marched from the north, swallowing the outer fields, burying the canals, piling against the gates until the doors buckled inward. The sun baked the roofs until they sagged, cracked, and collapsed, sending up sighs of dust that drifted like smoke. The rains came once in a generation, brief and violent, washing through the courtyards and carving channels through the plazas before vanishing again. Salt crept from the earth and spread over the stones in white crusts like the bloom of old bones. Seasons passed, years, centuries. The last scraps of wood rotted to powder. The plaster peeled from the towers in great white scabs. The murals of bulls and crescents faded to ghosts. The great granaries sank under their own weight, their vaults collapsing in slow silence. The Tower of the Moon cracked down its spine and shed its silver like dead skin. One by one, the walls folded inward, sighing into themselves. Dashley disappeared. No one spoke its name. No one remembered its markets or its songs or the man who had dreamed it from dust. Travelers passed over the plain without knowing what lay beneath their feet. Shepherds grazed their flocks among the dunes and heard only the wind. The world closed over Dashley as gently as water closing over a stone, and the ripples faded until there was nothing. But nothing is never nothing. Far beneath the dunes, the city slept. The sand sealed its corridors like gauze, mummifying the rooms in silence. The hearth still held black circles of ash. The clay bins still smelled faintly of old grain. The seal impressions still lay in the archives, brittle but whole, rows of tiny symbols pressed by hands that had turned to dust. The air was dry and still and absolute. Time did not move here. The city did not breathe. It only waited. It waited for 3,000 years. Then the wind shifted. It happened as it always does in the desert, with no warning, no reason, only inevitability. A great storm rose from the north, grinding the dunes into the sky. For 3 days the sun vanished behind a red haze. When the storm passed, the land had changed. The dunes were gone. In their place lay bones of mudbrick, pale and cracked, protruding from the sand like the ribs of something titanic and long dead. The first shepherd to see them thought they were the remains of a beast killed by the gods. The second thought they were the ruins of a fortress from the age of giants. The third fetched men with shovels. They dug for years. The sand fought them, pouring back into every pit as fast as they cleared it. But they persisted. Slowly the city revealed itself. Double walls, fallen towers, T-shaped corridors filled with dust. They found the granaries. Their clay bins toppled like broken jars. They found the Tower of the Moon, split and hollow, its silver long stolen by the wind. They found the plazas littered with bones turned to chalk, the shattered altars, the corroded bronze blades. They found no name. There were no inscriptions, no epitaphs, no song lines carved into stone. The walls rose and curved and folded back on themselves without a single word to say what they had been. The city offered its body but not its soul. The diggers called it Dashley after the oasis whose name had survived on the lips of distant tribes. But the true name, the name he had once sworn would outlast time, was gone. Only once did they find something that hinted at him. In the hearth of the inner citadel, beneath layers of ash and stone, they uncovered a small object carved from black steatite, a seal. Its surface was worn smooth except for the faint ghost of a design. A four-pointed star flanked by twin bulls, barely visible in the light. It had been buried deliberately, hidden away like a heart removed from a corpse. The archaeologist who found it turned it over in her hand, frowning, trying to imagine the hand that had pressed it. She could not. She placed it in a box. She labeled it simply, Unidentified Ruler, Dashley. That was all. Today the ruins lie under a pale sky that has forgotten their name. The wind combs their broken walls. Lizards bask on the toppled stones. The sand hums softly as it shifts, as if whispering to itself. Visitors walk the cracked plazas with cameras dangling from their necks, murmuring about irrigation systems and trade routes and the diffusion of Bronze Age cultures. They speak in the language of measurements, of layers and strata and typologies. They say the city was part of a civilization, the Oxus Civilization, and that its people vanished when the rivers changed their course. They are not wrong, but sometimes when the sun is low and the wind is still, the ruins seem to change. The air thickens. The shadows lengthen like dark fingers. The stones seem to rise taller, straighter, as if remembering their old shape. For an instant you can almost hear it, the echo of drums, the clash of markets, the hiss of forges, the soft murmur of rituals. The scent of grain and incense seems to drift through the broken courtyards. The silver tower seems whole again, catching the moonlight like a blade, and high above it all stands a figure, black against the dying sun. Thin as hunger, crowned in dust, his eyes like wells without bottom. The wind shifts, the light flickers, the figure is gone, only the silence remains.